2024. I'm your host, Mervyn Williams. We'll be speaking with Mr. Vincent Alexander, Chair of Epadagy and holder of, or wearer of many other hats. And we'll be discussing emancipation and the state of the African Guyanese community. Mr. Alexander, as always, it's an honor to have you on Nation Watch, and I take this opportunity to welcome you and to express to our viewers that we're in for a treat today as well.
Thank you very much.
Before we get to the heart of our conversation, Mr. Alexander, Emancipation Day was a few days ago. Share with us, please, your reflection on the activities of Emancipation Day 2024 in Guyana.
I think there are three aspects of Emancipation Day that we ought to pay attention to. First of all, Emancipation Day has maintained itself as a tradition of the people of African descent in celebrating what occurred 183 years ago. And I think we ought to note that to a very large extent, when we have Emancipation Day, what we're doing is celebrating what happened 183 years ago. Words have meaning, and they have to be contextualized. So when we talk about emancipation that occurred 183 years ago, we're really talking about a moment where the enslaved were released from bondage, released from physical enslavement, and in some regards recategorized, I would say, as human beings.
Yeah.
Because under slavery,
Chattel.
So they were chattel, they were, and the actually expressions of them being just three-quarter of a human being and things like that. So that emancipation is a celebration of that moment. And that is critical because as a celebration of that moment, the question is, what else did it mean, or what else does it mean? Contextualizing it at that moment, it is exactly what we just said. Abolishing chattel slavery, allowing the enslaved people to become wage earners, so to speak. But there is much more to that concept of emancipation that was not embodied in the moment of 1834.
Which I'm sure we will get deeply into, but spare us your thoughts on, share with us your thoughts on the actual day's activity,
Right,
if you will, please.
So the actual day's activity is celebratory in a sense, where people of African descent come out and commemorate what happened 183 years ago. And they do that in more or less cultural forms to a very large extent. In some villages, they go beyond cultural forms. They do things like feeding and educational moments. So it's really a celebratory day and a celebratory moment across the African Guyanese community, where people kind of come alive for that day in memory, if one may say so, in memory, in some forms of nostalgia, the kind of foods that are emphasized, the kind of cultural activities that are emphasized, nostalgic. And it can be a kind of a jerk on one's memory, having lived 364 days, on the Huskins. One can stop in that day and say, have I really been emancipated? So it provides an opportunity for reflection as well, and for projection. In the case of Guyana, Emancipation Day has also been a day centered around a human right, and that's the right of association and the right of expression. So that to a large extent, Emancipation Day gives the people of African descent to come together as a people to celebrate. And it's critical that we understand that because this year in particular, we've seen an incursion into that right of association,
Mhm.
where the normal grassroots activities are placed in a situation of competition with top-down activities that do not start from the heart of the African people, but start from a political movement that seeks to control and dominate the people of African descent. And so, in some regards, we see attempts to replicate the state that they were in at the time of 183 years ago, state of domination, a state of subjugation, although they had transitioned from being considered to be chattel to be human beings.
Mhm.
So what we saw this year was a number of organizations being formed that do not have their origin in the community, so to speak. They have their origins in a maneuver by the state and by the government to occupy the space for the purposes of domination and control. And I dare say this leads to a reintroduction or to some kind of retrograde movement in terms of the state of the people of African descent. Because these activities really, under these fake, one for want of a better word, organizations are not really expressions of celebration of 183 years ago, nor are they expressions of aspirations in terms of the way forward, because one cannot be celebrating 183 years ago if one allows oneself to be led, if one allows oneself to pander to financial resources rather than the true spiritual engagement in an activity uh, of celebration of what happened 183 3 years ago. So we've seen, in some regards, a denigration of this activity, moving away from the hard cultural and spiritual activities into, let me use a term that has been introduced into Guyana, into the stink and dirty in some instances. Now, I'm not saying that the African Guyanese at large are into that, but I'm saying there's been an introduction of that, trying to supersede the real cultural activities um, by some forces, and therefore not lending to an upliftment and consciousness and aspirations, and not looking back and saying this is what emancipation meant then, and this is the journey we embarked on after emancipation, because emancipation is a moment, but there was a journey embarked upon immediately after emancipation.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that there's a pushback on that journey by virtue of the manner in which emancipation is being treated. It is now being politicized, so to speak. It is no longer, in every instance, allowed to be a people's activity where
Yeah.
people freely express themselves. It's now a political activity where uh, government and the People's Progressive Party inserts itself for the purpose of domination and for the purpose of politicking. So it's all about how do we mobilize to keep a whole party in power and in control, rather than how do we provide space and time for an expression of a people.
It has moved away from a celebration of a struggle, the successes of that struggle, the birth of a new nation, and it has in fact moved to a struggle for votes by the People's Progressive Party, who clearly as a collective lack an appreciation of the real meaning of emancipation to a people who have gone through hell. Mr. Alexander, from 1526 to 1867, 12.5 million Africans were forcefully removed from the continent, many of them destined for this region, others to North America. Only 10.7 million made it across that passage. The others were thrown into the ocean. It is the kind of story that can only appeal to someone who has a heart, someone who has a conscience. It is the kind of reality that only invokes the true sentiments of a human being with a human heart. And to trivialize that kind of suffering of a people and to play politics with that kind of suffering of a people tells you what the government, the People's Progressive Party political leadership, it tells you where their mind is at and where their heart, if they have that, may exist. I mean, 30,000 people were moved from Africa forcefully against their will in the 1690s. By the 1790s, there were 85,000 people per year shipped out of the continent of Africa. In the Guyana context, the canals that we talk about, drainage and irrigation canals in the sugar belt, the rice fields, in the city, which obviously served as estates. The African who came here physically worked with shovel and pick to create those canals, to build those dams. The crack of a whip, the opening of wounds on the back, the joining of blood with sweat and tears falling into the soil that we now walk on, that we now treat with disrespect, that we try to control or to leverage control over without regard for the suffering, the pain, the sorrow, the effort that went in to building what we now have, failing to recognize the reality that this was all done with no reward or for no reward. In fact, when this was being done, the Africans were fed a diet that several generations later continued to affect the health of the African Caribbean citizen. Diabetes, hypertension, and all these diseases that were created by the diet that was fed to Africans. In those circumstances, any human being, particularly any president or leadership of any country that treats trivially with the issue of emancipation and the issue of the Africans, the descendant of African slaves in any society, speaks, in my opinion, of a sick set of people. But in 1964, an African Guyanese, the son of former slaves, was elected premier of this country. Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, elected premier in 1964. And for the first time since 1526, the Africans in this particular society benefited from a structured form of leadership, from organization, from the establishment of cooperatives, from the formalization of the village movement, from governance at the highest level. Much was done between 1964 and 1992 to give the African Guyanese descendant of slaves the assurance that that this whole business of emancipation meant something. Today, Mr. Alexander, we see the snatching away of the freedoms. We see the snatching away of the earned positions. We see the trivialization of the contribution of the Africans to this country. Talk to us.
Well, the first point I want to make in that regard has to do with the way in which the story is told. We live in a country where there is a refusal to tell the whole and the true story of the people of African descent. And so if, for example, you were to go to our school system and look at the curriculum history, much of what you just spoke about is not told to anyone, and more particularly to the people who are the descendants of those who went through that path which you refer to. So that there is a conscious movement to erase from history the realities of the people of African descent, as much as there is a conscious movement of revisionism in relation to the history of the people of African descent. Because if one accepts all those things which you just spoke about, it will be recognized that there is a tremendous need for reparations. When I speak about reparations here, I'm not speaking merely about compensation from the former slave masters. I'm speaking about a total repair in relation to the people of African descent, a repair which is material and a repair which is psychological, spiritual, and mental. And that repair requires a lot of equitable action, because the damage done to those people is incomparable to the damage done to others. And to redress and rectify that requires a commitment of resources. And here is not only a question of material resources, but a commitment in terms of the kind of environment, the kind of programs, the kind of tutelage that takes place in the society. And an understanding, expression of an understanding that where the people of African descent are is not a simple function of their being. It's a function of a system. It's a function that has created them in a particular way that is in contradiction to their natural being and the rich history from which they came. And so we are challenged really. We are challenged really to get the people in authority to understand and to accept, not only understand, but to accept the historic reality of people of African descent, the sacrifices, the involuntary contributions, but nevertheless extremely valuable. In fact, the foundation of this nation is built, the material foundation of this nation is built on the back of the people of African descent. And in some regards, the soul of the nation has been affected by the way in which their souls were denigrated. And so we have the repair that's required is both material in terms of repair to the person, the person.
Which leads us to a very interesting aspect of this conversation. The current state of the African Guyanese community. Now, there is a battle for survival by Guyanese in general, but perhaps more so for the African Guyanese, given the politics of our country. The struggle for survival, for putting food on the table, for keeping children in school, for taking care of medical circumstances that may from time to time arise. This has taken 100% of the attention and focus of the average African Guyanese. To the extent that, and this is my own view, to the extent that the pride associated with the struggle of the forebearers of the African Guyanese is not so much focused upon any longer, because there is no room in the psyche of the average African Guyanese for anything else but survival.
It's a little more, it starts before that. How do you have this pride if you don't have the knowledge?
Well, here's where I'm going. Here's exactly where I'm going. Now, there appears to me to be the absence of a hunger for information. There appears to me to be no real quest for unearthing the kind of information that needs to be fed into the psyche of the African Guyanese. And I'm wondering about two things here. Whether the preoccupation with survival is in fact a deterrent in that regard. And two, is it because the African leaders of this country have not stepped up to say, here we are? Look, my view is that there's need for a person, an organization, an institution, or several of them to create in Guyanese in general, and particularly in the African Guyanese mind, the desire for information, for education about the historical aspects of where we are, how we got here. And there's also a need for those entities, once they emerge, to satisfy that need for education. Is IPADG one of these organizations? And if it is, what has it been doing in this regard?
Let me backtrack a bit to go to your earlier comment about the emergence of Burnham, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't think that we should ignore the fact that even before the emergence of Burnham, that you had African Guyanese leadership. And in that regard, Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow comes to mind, because in many regards, his leadership was also structured. It was not, so that, and there were a lot of other emergent bodies of African people that sought to give leadership. A lot of it was intellectual and academic and journalistic and things like that. But there has always been, immediately after emancipation, so to speak, there has always been a lot of attempts at giving leadership to the people of African descent. But what is important to note is that the people of African descent, unlike other peoples in Guyana, would not have had the kind of institutional framework that others would have. And let me get to the chase on that.
Mhm.
If you take the Indo-Guyanese, for example, they came, they were indentured, they're exploited, but they were able to keep their institution to a large extent the Hindu religion. And therefore, they had an institutional framework
Mhm.
that kept them together and kept them going.
Mhm.
Slavery was built around the institution of oppression and division, and therefore the people of African descent had no institution of their own.
Mhm.
Those things were taken away from them. And when you look at the generational situation, the first set of people who came would have come with some memory and some knowledge, and therefore, but slavery sought to strip them of that and therefore make it difficult for it to be passed on to
Mhm.
other generations. And so that is the creation of a lesser than African being by
Mhm.
virtue of what the plantation system was intended to do. And here is where the difficulty is that after emancipation, a lot of that continued in terms of, because you see, slavery was all about not just racism. Racism was a mechanism to denigrate a particular race in the material interests of another race.
Mhm.
So the material interests was really what was driving everything else. The material interest, with racism being a mechanism to say, well, we have a just right
Mhm.
to be doing this. And so the people of African descent were deprived, both from a psychological perspective and from a material perspective, the the foundation, which is economic well-being, to be a people. And in that context, not also not to have an institution where ideally you are at one really shatters the existence of the community as a collective. And what we have seen is that because material interest is what has driven all of this, is that you have the emergence of a class along a continuum from the plantation owners that continue to impose upon the people of African descent in particular, I'm not saying on them alone,
Mhm.
a certain status quo so that the upper class could be the beneficiary of their labor, because labor is really the source of the production of wealth.
Mhm.
The same labor you talked about in terms of building of Guyana. That's where development really comes from. Labor, but it is combined with some form of idea and some form of how you want to structure things. So that indeed the challenge of the people of African descent has been the question of institution. And one institution which was destroyed uh, by slavery was the institution of the family, because the family is the basic unit. And unless you have that institution in place, then basically you have a problem with the basic unit. And so the issue of the African family coming out of the manner in which they were treated in slavery, non-existence of the family in one hand, and the manner of gender relations on the other hand, have all imposed upon the people of African descent a state that has to be repaired, but it can only be repaired if it is recognized to be.
Damaged.
And the system has done everything to ensure there isn't that recognition of the problem. And you've mentioned a whole range of things. A lot of people don't realize that The diet, for example, was a diet to give you energy, not to build your body in a holistic way, was to make you a worker. And that has had its results in terms of the diseases you've talked about. And therefore, when you're talking about addressing the issues of people of African descent, those are issues that have to be addressed, and those are issues that are peculiar. And here is where we have the problem, where there is a tremendous denial by this government and by this state that those are issues to be addressed if the people of African descent are to be given a fair chance to realize the inherent and innate potential which they have. Now we saw in many regards Burnham attempting to do some of those things. However, in the environment in which he attempted it, in some regards, he was not as overt as probably he should have been. And so, even what he was doing, which was required, was seen as a wrong. So that, whether it's the co-op movement, whether it's the approach to housing, all of this was seen as something wrong and seen as discriminating against others, when in fact, in retrospect, was really equitable action to repair what had occurred historically to the people of African descent. And so we have a situation in Guyana today where there's still this insistence that these things never really happened. And because they never really happened, then there's no need to address. When you look at the decade, you talk about the Paddy. When you look at the decade for the people of African descent, if you go to read the Durban Declaration, which really started this process towards the decade, and you read the United Nations Declaration, in those declarations, these people clearly have come to recognize what has historically been done to the people of African descent, the whole act of dehumanization, discrimination, etc. And the impact of those things based on the mentality, on the health, on the social status, on the culture, all of that, these declarations have come to recognize and have said, look, there is the need for repair. Give these people an opportunity to come out of that state which was imposed upon them. But we have ended up in a situation where, when, for example, Burnham was trying to do some of the things, he was accused of being racial, he was accused of being a dictator and things like that. And now we have a government which says, look, we don't have those problems you all are talking about. If you have those problems, you were part of the problem. The current government, in responding to the UN, posing questions about the state of the African Guyana, said in black and white some damning things. They said, look, what are they complaining about? When they were free, instead of getting involved in commercial activities, they go and plant provision. So who's to be blamed for their economic state of not making money by being involved in commerce, rather they got involved in sustenance? So that on one hand, there is a contention that, look, really these problems they are talking about don't exist. But on the other hand, there is a contention that if these problems exist, you are yourself the problem. And I've heard even black people, Minister Hamilton, Minister Waldron, repeating these things, that the problem is, of our own being, not recognizing that there was a system that worked and fashioned, and that some of the things we did were responses to that system. So, for example, when our lands were flooded and we wanted sustainability, stability, then we moved towards employment. That created a psychological disposition which says, look, let's go and get employed. Because if you get employed, you're paid monthly. If you stay in the village where they flood your
You
village,
starve.
then you lose your crops, you're starved, and all of that. So here is an emergent cycle of the African Guyanese employability. But you end up with employability in an economic system when there are economic problems. It's just like the village being flooded because, again, those who are employed, particularly in the public service, are the ones who suffer. And so we have not accepted the whole understanding of the evolution of the African Guyanese and an evolution which has uh, denigrated, put him at the bottom of the ladder, as Chedi Jagan said. And the need for the environment which put him there to be corrected, to facilitate his natural being and to climb that ladder.
Let's dig some more into this. No. The institutions that need to recognize the issues that we're talking about continue to defy logic, continue to ignore reality, continue to put truth below their feet. There is no African Guyanese rice farmer, rice miller.
There is one in West Borvis trying.
Well, I know that
It's just statistically there's none. So
there's none. I know one large scale African Guyanese rice farmer from Berbice who is just pulled out of rice farming. Milling is another issue. We know of the situation in the Namstel when political instructions were issued for no paddy to be taken to a certain rice mill. We saw the movement of the owner of that rice mill going really economically spiraling downwards, and then we had bankruptcy and eventually hold on a second, eventually that particular rice miller became an employee of this administration. And then we had another rice miller on the Essequibo coast who had similar problems. Now, there was one African Guyanese large contractor that I know of who seemed not to be getting contracts anymore. We don't hear the Ben name anymore unless we're talking Home Affairs. I do not know of any African Guyanese hotelier of any kind of high economic standing. A 100-year-old business in this country, the Lycan Funeral Parlor, has now become the target of the administration. The contract for picking up dead bodies that they had with the Guyana police force is allegedly withdrawn, and all these things are happening. In the meantime, the head of state of this country goes into African Guyanese villages and offers them contracts to clean drains. I mean, he did it a couple of weeks ago at iFlood. You get drain cleaning contracts and so on. So this movement from forced labor, zero reward, a diet that creates problems for several generations down the road, the scars borne by the African Guyanese, the kind of work that they did. Yes, of course, they moved to employment, as you said, then there was an expanded public sector in that regard, which was crushed when the PPP came to government. Between 1992 and 1997, the public service shrunk by about 25,000
it's always
jobs.
affected when you have economic problems.
Yeah.
So they bear the burden of the state.
So here are these problems. And now this administration finds the solution to the problem as denigrating the African Guyanese community by saying to persons of African descent that basically in the same way that you suffered under the crack of the whip to create the drainage and irrigation infrastructure and the dam structures in this country, your ancestors, that is to say, now we will give you little contracts to do the same menial jobs. What are you doing to the psyche of the people?
Let me say a couple of things. Let me go back to the Namstel case. I happen to have worked in Region 3 as the regional executive officer.
Yeah.
I tell you what my experience was. At that time, the state had machinery that would be leased out to farmers so they can prepare the land. You know the experience we had in the Namstel? Every time the operator went to the Namstel, they would complain that the machine had broken down, the combine or the tractor had broken down. And then when they moved that combine or tractor to another village, it works.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a clear case of sabotage
Yeah.
of the African Guyanese endeavor in the Namstel. Then somebody would come along and say to the African Guyanese, man, why you don't sell me the land?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're making it. You see, but it's clear as a consequence of sabotage. So here's an example of what institutional arrangements which the UN is saying should be changed to affect the people of African descent. Let me give you another example. Psychological state. Now, I remember years ago, I have an old Hilux Surf, and I drove this Hilux Surf into a gas station. And a little black boy came up to me and says, big man, you're driving boss man vehicle. Here is evidence of a state where this little boy, in his formative years, has already accepted that that kind of quote-unquote wealth doesn't belong to his kind.
Mm-hmm.
It got to belong to somebody else. So I can't be owning it. I got to be driving boss man vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
I know what struck me only the other day. I stopped and I thought of it after a while. I went to a gas station to gas up my vehicle, a Surf, a SUV, and the attendant asked me if I wanted a receipt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that would seem to be something pretty routine,
Mm-hmm.
but somebody who wants a receipt would ask for it.
Yeah.
But why did he ask me? And I said to myself, thinking about that little boy saying, boss man, you're driving somebody's vehicle. That attendant probably does not perceive that an African Guyanese or African Guyanese routinely are the owners of that kind of asset.
So you must account to the boss for the
So I gotta
expenditure.
get a receipt to carry to the boss.
Mhm.
So it shows you a disposition, the little boy, a disposition of the African Guyanese, and a disposition of others towards the African Guyanese. So it's coming from both sides.
Mhm.
And the mentality has been affected on both sides, none of which helps the state of the African Guyanese. So we get into that Bob Marley's understanding of
Mental slavery.
mental slavery. And hence my earlier comment that emancipation in 1838 has to be contextualized. It's not something that liberated the total African Guyanese being. It liberated him from a certain kind of economic relationship, but it did not liberate him in terms of complete freedom and control over his being, and retain the essence of an exploitive economic relationship with a superstructure that seeks to keep that relationship the way it was. You know, all of these issues of health and all of that are built upon the economic relations, you know.
Mr. Alexander, as always, when we have these conversations, time seems to just slip by almost unnoticed. We're almost out of time. But I want to ask you, and this may very well be the last question of the program, given what I anticipate would be the detailed response you'll offer. For many people, it is a question of what does emancipation mean? For me, and in the context of this conversation, the question would be, what should emancipation mean to the African Guyanese in particular, but to the wider Guyanese nation as a whole?
One has to see emancipation in two contexts: in the context of internal relations and in the context of international relations. I think we should focus largely in our circumstance in this discussion on internal relations. And emancipation from the standpoint of internal relations means that all of our people must have the same opportunities in relation to each other and in relation to the resources that the country has as at our disposal. The difficulty we have is that the structures of slavery, many of which continued in reality after slavery, did not provide and does not provide that kind of equal opportunity which we're talking about. And the best example, is to see what happened in terms of trading activities after emancipation, where the Portuguese were brought, they were given license to trade, and literally the people of African descent were forbidden from trading, which means you were doing two things. It was material deprivation, you're not allowing them to get involved in the area of wealth creation, but it is also the creation of a mentality of who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. And so you have that as an example of how the African Guyanese has been positioned in our society and fashioned by our society as well. Then you look at the whole question, let's look at the contemporary situation in Guyana. We have happened to have, I would say, geographic settlements, ethno-geographic settlements. Except for the urban areas, largely we have ethno-geographic settlements. And one could see that where you have the Indo-Guyanese, you can see how historically attention is being paid to developing those communities in terms of the agriculture, historically. And if you go to even our contemporary budget, and you see where the work is being done in terms of drainage, in terms of an irrigation, you can see where the attention is being paid. And this is not today, this has been historical. And if you go to the African Guyanese community, you would see that there is neglect in that regard. But there are two aspects to that neglect. There's a physical aspect, but there's also the historical mental degradation that does not allow the African Guyanese to address the question of his lands in the same manner in which the Indo-Guyanese probably address the question of lands. And so the state has a responsibility. We among ourselves, those of us who are conscious, have a responsibility to work with our brothers and sisters, but the state has a responsibility. If the state says it's upholding human rights, and the whole question of the equality, then it has a responsibility to understand who is where and how to get them to that point of the things they declare to be what they want to do. And therefore, in those circumstances, equity becomes critical. Equity in terms of how you fashion your health system, how you do work with people in terms of the diet, which could be a part of an extension of your health system. Equity is required, resources are required in those areas, commitment is required in those areas, understanding is required in those areas. But unfortunately in Guyana, we have a pushback and a contention that these are not issues, that everybody has the same opportunity. And so nobody's accepting that it has been established that there is a traumatic state of affairs coming out of slavery. And so don't tell us that don't talk about history, because we're living that history in terms of that trauma which we've experienced. And therefore there's need for action to overcome the trauma. And the trauma covers all of our activities because it covers how we see life. And if the system reinforces that trauma, then how we see life is dysfunctional. And one can equate it, for example, to an American going to war and suffering the trauma of war and coming back and being dysfunctional in society. And so when you tell an African Guyanese, y'all don't like business, y'all not entrepreneurial, is it that African people are naturally against business? If that is the case, why is it different in Barbados? Why is it different in Africa? It has to do with the way things have evolved and the way forces have fashioned people's being. People's being is largely fashioned by the environment. And if that environment does certain things, people are responsive, it fashions their being, but it may fashion their being in a manner that imposes, perpetuates a disadvantage in relation to what the environment could otherwise provide for them. So we have a serious problem of politicians running around uh, reinforcing in some people who are affected that they're not affected, and that's what this emancipation, in fact, some regards means. You take some people somewhere, give them drinks and all of that, and tell them those other people want to mislead you, but everything is okay because here you have drinks and here you have some money to go and do some projects, but not addressing the core issue of the state, material and psychological state of the African Guyanese, which has to be addressed and can be addressed with some simple things. First of all, by simply telling them, teaching them their real history so that they can know who they are. And based on knowing who they are, they can then step out in confidence to confront the issues that confront them, including issues of entrepreneurship and things like that. So, whilst you may have some incremental changes here or there, the system at large is still not facilitating the people of African descent. And what is happening is that emphasis is still on this question of business and exploitation. And whilst one would say, well, what's wrong with the capitalist system? You could see that in some parts of the world, there are capitalist systems that are welfare oriented, and therefore people have a fair chance. And there are other capitalist systems that are top heavy. And in the case of Guyana, it's top heavy, and it happens to be top heavy with one ethnic group at the top.
Mr. Vincent Alexander, Chairman of IPADG, joining me today on Nation Watch. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, time never seems enough when Mr. Alexander is here to chat with us on Nation Watch. So next Sunday, by God's grace, we'll be speaking with Dr. David Hines right here, and we'll be discussing reparations and the economic well-being of the African Guyanese. That's all we have time for today on Nation Watch. And Mr. Alexander, I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out to join me here and to share with our viewing population across the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Until we meet again, I am Mervyn Williams saying so long until next Sunday when we meet again.